Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HTM here with another PTS patch note update. We're talking about the Markarth DLC, of course. And in this video, I want to look specifically at some of the class balance changes that have come out, as well as changes to weapon skill lines and other skill lines in ESO. So let's go ahead and jump right into it, starting off with class balance changes and the Necromancer class. So in the Gravelord skill line, just some tweaks made to Blast Bones. It says, made some improvements to the cooldown duration of this ability to reduce the chances of it becoming locked out. Despite the skeleton dying, that is a bug I noticed in the Stonethorn DLC. So hopefully that is fixed now. Now, no mention of the Magicka morph of Blast Bones, which is pretty much, doesn't do anything special. I'm hoping that they do look at that at some point to improve that. And then Frozen Colossus, some tweaks with this. They removed this ultimate and the morph's major vulnerability invulnerability. I'm not really sure what that means. Is that like a joke? I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments. But then down here, increase the duration of major vulnerability to 12 seconds per hit, up from 8. So this will increase the total duration to 15 seconds per ultimate cast. So 15 seconds of major vulnerability. Now, this probably has to do with them decreasing the strength of major vulnerability. And if you don't know what that's about, make sure you check out my last video where I talked about every major and minor buff getting changed in the Markarth DLC. So some of those offensive buffs are now less powerful, including major vulnerability. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of these changes. Some will have to do with that major and minor buff system. Moving on now to Nightblades and Assassination, the Executioner passive. This now restores up to 1000 Magicka and Stamina when it procs, rather than either resource depending on your highest maximum. I do actually like this. This is a great change for Nightblades since traditionally they do use more resources than most classes. Stamina Nightblade has to like cloak, for example, or run shade. So you are a little bit more dependent on both pools being sustained, and this is going to be an excellent change for hybrid builds as well. So more resources restored is always a good thing. And then Master Assassin, this passive was buffed last patch, I believe, to give a lot of weapon and spell damage. Bonus weapon and spell damage actually while you were flanking an enemy, which is pretty strong. So now this passive increases your physical and spell penetration against your targets you're flanking, rather than giving you bonus weapon and spell damage. Okay. So there is a developer comment. Let's go ahead and read about that. So this passive is now in a much better place regarding its accessibility and use cases. Class was performing a bit too well in high-end PvE DPS. With the adjustment to penetration, you can expect more damage in non-optimized PvE and PvP encounters against high mitigation targets, while tuning back some of their scaling in high-end PvE content and specialized gank builds in PvP. All right, so some of you might be thinking this is a nerf, but I actually agree with the developer comment, especially regarding high-end PvE content. Any extra weapon or spell damage scales so high in those situations, it pretty much becomes the meta. That's why we've seen already, race metas in terms of DPS builds. Orc is always the best for stamina. High Elf is always the best for Magicka, and the reason why? They get an extra 258 weapon or spell damage no matter what. So I do agree with this. That passive was easily pushing them to the highest ranks of DPS in terms of like trials, and I do kind of like the change. So the penetration is still going to give you more damage in situations like, let's say, small groups where you're not optimized. And also, if you're soloing and if you're playing PvP, open world or even battlegrounds, the extra penetration is most likely going to give you more damage. But this way, it doesn't also become over the top in PvE trials content specifically. So I do like this change. I am curious what you think of this, though. If you're a Nightblade main, let us know in the comment section what you think of the change to that passive. Moving on to Shadow and Path of Darkness, they just fixed an issue with Refreshing Path. And then Summon Shade fixed an issue there as well. Under Siphoning and the Soul Shred ability, the Soul Siphon Morph fixed an issue where this ultimate could aggro enemies despite dealing no damage. And then Drain Power. Power Extraction is the Stamina Morph of this AoE skill. It's a pretty good skill now. But this morph now applies minor cowardice to enemies hit, rather than reducing their weapon and spell damage by a unique amount. So a unique debuff is now minor cowardice. This is actually a larger decrease in weapon and spell damage, but one that cannot be stacked with other resources. Okay, that's fine. So Nightblade is looking okay. I mean, if you were top end, like super top end trial content, you might notice a little bit of a DPS decrease due to that lack of weapon and spell damage. Let's move on to the Templar Adric Spear. And the Spear Shard's ability fixed an issue with the synergy. Okay, that's good. And then Sun Shield and the Blazing Shield morph fix an issue where this ability's explosion vigils would multiply in intensity with the number of enemies hit. And then Restoring Light and Healing Ritual, Ritual of Rebirth, fix an issue where this heal was targeting the ally furthest from you within its range rather than prioritizing allies who needed the heal. Okay, that's fine. So they fixed the healing, and that's it for the Templar. Let's look at Wardens now. So some pretty big changes to Wardens that I wanted to highlight for you all, especially if you play a Stamina Warden. So under Animal Companions, the ultimate here, Feral Guardian, fixed an issue with this ultimate, and the Crushing Swipe attack, it could fail to hit large monsters like dragons or titans, that's fine. But then check out our friend Subterranean Assault. This morph no longer applies Fracture, as Deep Fissure now affects all armor, and this ability now recasts itself after completing once per cast. What does this mean, right? There's a lot actually happening with this skill. So first off, this morph, the Stamina morph, no longer applies Fracture because the Fracture debuff is gone. It's no longer in the game. And what we have now is just Major Breach. So basically, just like they did with armor, they've now combined the armor debuffs into one singular stat. That's going to reduce basically the enemy's spell resistance and physical resistance at once. So it's one combined debuff. Now what they say is this morph no longer applies Fracture, as Deep Fissure now affects all armor. So Deep Fissure now gets the armor debuff that debuffs both stats. And Deep Fissure, that's the Magicka morph, right? So for Magicka Wardens, you're fine. You actually debuff both stats. This would be fine also for tank builds if you don't want to use Pierce Armor. But what about Stamina Wardens, right? What do? Well, you just don't basically have the option anymore. So this is pretty much a direct nerf to Stamina Warden, especially in solo content or in PvP, where you were getting more damage from having that easy access to Major Fracture, right? I feel like they've had that debuff for so long. It's kind of part of the class kit that both Stamina and Magicka Warden can reduce resistances. I feel like they should both have it. Now, I kind of wish also there was a developer comment here, because unlike the Nightblade change, where they changed the passive, we had a nice dev comment explaining the reason for that, and it made sense. But when I look at the change to Subterranean Assault, I don't see any comment, and I don't understand why this is done. This does not make sense to me to remove that debuff for Stam Warden. What I think they should do, and hopefully they will do this in a future PTS release, is I think not just Deep Fissure, but I think the base morph of the skill should just have Major Breach. That way both Stamina and Magicka morphs could have that debuff, and you could choose which one you wanted based on your build. So then the fact that this ability now recasts itself once per cast, this was just basically added on after the fact to try to give Stamina Warden something to say, hey, now this ability is unique. It doesn't have Fracture anymore, but it's unique because it recasts itself. I did try this out on the PTS. It's okay, but I mean, honestly, nobody asked for this. Nobody asked for Sub-Assault to recast itself. It's kind of awkward, I would say. I mean, yes, you'll probably get a bit of a boost for your sustain because you don't have to cast it. But now if you're a Stam Warden main, you're going to have to retrain yourself, adjust your rotation a little bit to figure out how this works. It's kind of awkward. I don't think we have any other abilities like this that recast themselves automatically, and you have to aim it still, so it's kind of awkward. It's kind of strange. So I feel like this skill is in a weird place now. Like I said, I honestly think the base skill should get Breach, and then we should have some more interesting effects. This is one of the main class-defining abilities of the Warden, and all it does is recast itself. Like, that's not really fun or interesting. There's so much more I think you could do with that skill. You know, maybe it could be like a guaranteed poison status effect, since it is a poison damage ability, I believe. You could also do something like slight increase, like maybe an extra 500 or 1,000 damage per target hit if you manage to aim it in a way where you hit multiple targets, because it is slightly skill-based gameplay having to aim sub-assault. I mean, it doesn't take a ton of skill, but it's more than most abilities. So rewarding players that, line up their burst and hit multiple targets at once, that would be more fun, in my opinion. But those are just my ideas. Like I said, let me know what you guys think in the comments section. We're going to jump down now to weapon skills. So Destruction Staff, in terms of the Frost Staff, we talked about this in my Markarth reveal video. This is being completely reworked, and the idea is they want Frost Staff to be more viable for support builds and for tanks. So basically what they say here is we also added more utility to the Frost Staff skills, giving them more viability as a backup weapon to complement support and bruiser playstyles, okay? So we'll see about this. First off, applying Chilled. While holding a Frost Staff now applies a new buff called Minor Brittle. We talked about this in the last video. Make sure you check that out if you haven't, where I cover all the major and minor buffs and how they've been changed. This basically is increased crit damage on the target, so it's a new debuff. Now the Destruction Expert passive is now updated as well. This now gives you 1800 magicka back whenever you absorb damage with a Frost Staff damage shield, and this can occur every 10 seconds. This is pretty nice for sustain using a Frost Staff. We'll see in the abilities down below where a lot of them apply damage shields. So I don't know so much about tanking, how useful that will be. But for soloing, I could see this as being quite effective, and now you're going to get extra sustain as well from running a Frost Staff, so not bad. Okay, Destructive Touch. Fix an issue with Destructive Clench Morph. And now the Destructive Clench while using a Frost Staff now taunts enemies for 15 seconds. So this is going to replace the heavy attack Frost Staff taunt that we'll see later on in the Tri-Focus passive. So this is an interesting change. They put it on an active ability to make it more controlled, and also it's instant cast, so you don't have to wind up a heavy attack to get that taunt. Now, is this better? Does it make Frost Staff tanking more viable? I don't know if it's better necessarily. I think it's kind of a weird choice because, first of all, we do have a magicka-based taunt called Inner Fire from the Undaunted skill line. That's already in the game, and it's instant cast, and you can use it with any weapon at range. You can even use it while equipping a sword and shield. So why would you need this? Well, I guess it's to give the Destruction Staff skill line a taunt. But the thing that's missing here is, from Sword and Shield, you get the taunt and you get Pierce Armor. You get the resistance debuff on an enemy at the same time. And this does not do anything like that. It's just a taunt and nothing else. So it would be nice to see some resistance debuff applied to this as well. Okay, let's keep going. Impulse. This got changed as well. Each elemental type for this ability now gains a new functionality, so this is pretty interesting. Flame Impulse deals bonus damage based on missing health if the target is burning, so that's kind of good, I guess. Frost Impulse now applies minor protection to up to 6 members for 6 seconds. I'm going to have to do some testing to check this out. I wonder what the range is and how this works specifically, because Impulse is a damage skill, so does this work based off enemy damage? Or is it based off the radius from when you cast it? And what about the ranged morph of this skill? This is interesting, kind of awkward again. So we definitely need to do some testing to see how that minor protection works. Shock Impulse now deals 5% more damage for each enemy hit, up to 30%. This is pretty strong, honestly. For DPS builds, you might want to look into that if you're not running it right now. Up to 30% damage increase. That's a lot. And then Tri-Focus, we talked about this briefly. This passive no longer causes your heavy attacks to taunt. They also increased the strength of the damage shield granted from heavy attacks up to 25% of your max health. So that's pretty good as well. That's why I mentioned earlier for solo builds, Frost Staff might actually be a really interesting option because you have so many strong damage shields on this skill line now. Speaking of that, let's look at Wall of Elements. The Frost version of this ability now applies a damage shield to you and 5 nearby group members that absorbs projectiles but no longer snares and deals less damage. Okay, so let's talk about that. First of all, the snare effect is gone, which is one of the reasons why I think tanks would have run this in the first place, right? For the snare and the potential immobilization. Now, if you don't have that, you're losing a major source of crowd control, especially for some classes that don't have that in their class kit. So I think that's a mistake. I'm not sure why they would remove the snare specifically on that when it's been part of the skill for so long. The damage shield, I guess, is fine. We don't know the value of the damage shield. But again, my question is, how does that work? Because Wall of Elements applies damage to enemies. So does this proc a damage shield when it does damage? Or does your group literally have to stand in the effect? Right? In most cases, they won't be standing in the effect if you're grouped with like some ranged builds. They're going to be way out on the perimeter away from you. How are they going to get this buff? So yeah, not too sure about that. I think range could be an issue with both of these damage shield effects, both on Impulse and Wall of Elements. But like I said, we'll need to do more testing on the PTS to verify that. They also fixed an issue with the shock version of this ability and the target cap. For Elemental Blockade, that morph specifically, the Frost version, now applies an additional smaller shield on you and group members in the area when it ends. Okay. Let's look at One-Handed Shield. Deadly Bash has a fixed issue on the passive, so that's fine. And then Puncture did get changed quite a bit as well. Let's look at this for tanking specifically. Now, this ability applies Major Breach rather than Fracture. We talked about that on Stamina Warden. Fracture is now gone from the game. So Major Breach, that reduces the enemy's physical and spell resistance, both of those combined. And then Pierce Armor, this morph, now applies Minor Breach as well. So even more physical and spell resistance debuffed on the enemy from Pierce Armor. That's going to be quite a bit. I think we might be seeing a lot more builds, non-tanks running Pierce Armor, especially in PvP, because this is going to be such a huge debuff. Now, Two-Handed and Berserker Strike fix an issue on the ultimate, having to do with camera shake, striking multiple targets. Armor fix an issue with some passive bonuses, did not apply to pets. Under the Werewolf skill line, transforming into a werewolf in front of NPCs, now properly considered a criminal act, okay? Roar and Hircine's Bounty. These abilities now always apply their major buffs while slotted, rather than only while in werewolf form. Sounds good. And then for the Rage morph, this morph now increases your damage taken by 8 to 5%, depending on the rank, down from 23 to 20. Okay, so this is quite good for werewolves, because you were taking substantial damage while using this ability, and now it's been reduced down to 5% at max rank, so that's pretty good. Some changes to the Blade of Woe, apparently. This passive now triggers whenever you kill an enemy with a Blade of Woe, rather than whenever you kill a citizen. So it will now work on non-civilian type enemies if you use the Blade of Woe, but will no longer proc off kills on civilians with non-Blade of Woe. Okay, interesting. For the Mage Guild skill line, Fire Rune has a fixed issue here, having to do with screen shake again, and then Undaunted and Trapping Webs fix numerous visual issues with this ability. And then really quick, let's talk about the champion point system. This is actually a major change having to do with crit chance. Reduce the weapon and spell critical chance granted from perfect strike and spell precision to 3% each, down from 9%. So that's a major shift in critical chance. So you're losing about 6% crit chance overall. Again, make sure you watch my previous video talking about major and minor buffs. I think it will equal out a little bit because we actually did get some increased crit chance from some of the major and minor buffs. So with that said, we'll go ahead and wrap up this video. Again, lots of interesting changes to both classes and weapon skills. I think in particular, the changes to Wardens are probably the most concerning, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Of course, if you liked the video today, don't forget to like it. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you're subscribed for more ESO videos just like this one. I'll be putting out many more videos this week and beyond, talking about the Markarth DLC and all of the new changes coming in. So until next time, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there, and I will see you around in the next video.